The morning sun touched the windows of the private hospital, but inside the billionaire's suite, there was no warmth. The room was filled with the constant beeping of machines and the sound of doctors speaking in hushed voices. Lying in the middle of the wide bed was Mr. Harrington, one of the richest men in the country. His face was pale, his eyes heavy, and his once strong body looked tired and fragile. People outside the hospital thought money could buy health, but inside this room, even his great fortune was helpless. Around his bed stood 20 of the most respected doctors from around the world. They had been flown in on private jets, given the best accommodation, and promised any amount of money if they could save him. Each doctor had his own specialty. Some were experts in the heart, others in the lungs, others in rare diseases. Their reputations were unmatched. And yet, after weeks of tests, medicines, and debates, none of them had been able to find out what was truly wrong with Mr. Harrington. Every day was the same. The doctors would gather around the bed, carrying heavy files full of reports, scans, and numbers. They would speak in complicated medical terms that confused even the family members who listened carefully. One doctor would say the problem was his liver, another would insist it was his nervous system, while yet another said it was his heart. Their discussions often turned into arguments, and their voices grew louder, but at the end of the day, the billionaire remained weak, unable to sit up without help. His family, his daughter, his son, and his sister watched all of this with broken hearts. They had trusted the world's best minds, but their father and brother was slipping away slowly. The daughter, Claire, stayed by his side the most. She held his hand gently, whispering words of comfort, though she herself was frightened. She had grown up seeing her father as a man who could solve any problem, a man who built companies, created thousands of jobs, and signed billion-dollar deals. But here he was, fragile and fading, surrounded by experts who could not find an answer. Outside the door, people whispered about the future of his empire. Business partners, managers, and employees were nervous. They knew that if he did not recover, the future of their work, their contracts, and even their jobs would change. But inside the hospital, none of that mattered to Claire. She only wanted her father back. Amid all this noise, there was someone in the room whom nobody noticed. Every morning, just as the doctors were preparing their rounds, a quiet figure entered with a cart of cleaning supplies. Her name was Martha. She was the housekeeper who had worked in the Harrington mansion for many years. When the billionaire was admitted to the hospital, his daughter had insisted that Martha continue to take care of the room. For the family, Martha was more than a worker. She was a familiar face who had been around for so long that she felt like part of the household. Martha was not dressed like the doctors. She wore a plain uniform, her hair tied neatly back, and her hands carried a rag and disinfectant. She moved softly, sweeping the corners, dusting the shelves, and polishing the glass. To the doctors, she was invisible. They did not greet her, they did not ask her name, and they never noticed when she quietly passed by. But while she worked silently, her eyes were always watching, and her mind was always taking notes. She had seen the billionaire in his strong days, walking across the marble halls of his mansion, giving instructions, or sitting by the fireplace with his daughter. To see him now lying helpless made her heart heavy. She had no medical training, but she had something else: years of observing, years of caring for others, and the kind of instincts that only come from paying attention to small details. As she straightened the pillows one morning, she noticed how Mr. Harrington winced slightly when his head turned a certain way. She saw how his fingers twitched when the doctors touched his arm. She even caught a faint smell in the air, something she remembered from her own childhood when someone in her village had fallen ill with a strange sickness. But she kept these thoughts inside, because who would listen to a housekeeper in a room full of world-famous doctors? Meanwhile, the doctors grew more restless. One day they tried a new drug, confident it would make a difference, but it only left Mr. Harrington feeling more tired. Another day, they spoke about flying him to Switzerland for a special treatment, but the family worried he might not survive the long journey. Each new idea felt like a gamble, and each failure made the atmosphere in the room heavier. Claire watched her father closely. She noticed that while the doctors checked his machines and charts, it was Martha who quietly adjusted the blanket when he shivered, who made sure his water glass was filled, and who spoke to him in a soft, kind tone. The billionaire, though weak, sometimes managed a faint smile at her. There was comfort in her presence that no amount of medical training could replace. Late one night, when the doctors had left and only the machines kept their steady rhythm, Martha stayed behind to finish her cleaning. She sat down for a moment, tired, and looked at Mr. Harrington. Something about his breathing, the way his chest moved, reminded her again of that illness from long ago. In her village, she had once watched an old healer treat a man who showed the same signs. At the time, she had thought little of it. Now, as she looked at the billionaire, those memories returned stronger. Still, she said nothing. She was just a housekeeper. She worried that if she spoke, the doctors would laugh or dismiss her. Yet in her heart, she felt a small voice telling her she was noticing something important. She tucked the thought away, not knowing that soon, her quiet observation would change everything. The next morning, as the sun rose again, the hospital room was once more filled with the sound of medical debates. The billionaire's face grew paler, his breaths shallower. 20 doctors, with all their learning and tools, still could not see what was truly happening. And in the corner, Martha continued her silent work, carrying with her the clue that everyone else had missed. The days stretched on, and the atmosphere in the billionaire's hospital room grew heavier. Every morning the doctors returned, their arms full of fresh reports, their minds full of new theories. They surrounded the bed like soldiers preparing for battle, but their war was against an invisible enemy they could not defeat. Their voices filled the room, bouncing off the white walls, words like organ failure, immune response, and rare condition echoing in the air. They argued over numbers and test results, pointing to graphs and screens, while the patient lay silently in the middle of it all. Mr. Harrington's body seemed smaller now, his frame swallowed by the large hospital bed. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes only opened for a few minutes each day. The man who once commanded boardrooms and signed billion-dollar contracts now barely had the strength to lift his hand. His family clung to hope, but even hope felt fragile. Claire tried to smile for him, whispering that everything would be all right, though her voice often shook. His son paced the hallway, his anger at the doctors growing with each passing day. His sister prayed quietly in the corner, unwilling to disturb the arguments of the professionals. Martha continued her work quietly as always. She came in at the same time every day, pushing her cleaning cart softly across the polished floor. She dusted the shelves, wiped the tables, and adjusted the curtains to let in just the right amount of light. No one paid her much attention. The doctors brushed past her without a glance, their eyes fixed on their charts. Nurses nodded politely but were too busy to stop and talk. To them, she was part of the background, as ordinary as the bed sheets or the machines. But Martha's eyes saw things differently. She noticed the small details no one else seemed to care about. She saw how Mr. Harrington's lips would twitch faintly when certain medicines were given. She noticed the slight way his body tensed whenever one doctor pressed too hard on his chest. She smelled a faint, strange odor that reminded her of the illness from her childhood village. She did not know the scientific name, but she remembered how the local healer had treated it with simple methods that worked when no one else could. One afternoon, when the doctors had left to review test results, Martha leaned close as she replaced the pillow under Mr. Harrington's head. His lips moved slightly, as if he were trying to say something. She bent lower and heard him whisper, almost inaudibly, "Tired, not right." Her heart squeezed. She wanted to reply, but before she could, his eyes closed again. She carefully adjusted the blanket and stood quietly by his side, her mind filled with unease. The next day, the doctors introduced yet another machine. This one was sleek, expensive, and capable of scanning every part of his body with advanced technology. They explained to the family how it would show hidden issues that no other machine could detect. The process was long, requiring Mr. Harrington to remain perfectly still, which exhausted him further. At the end of the procedure, the results came back unclear once again. The doctors frowned, scratching their heads. One suggested increasing the dose of his current medicine, another proposed trying a new drug. The arguments began again. Meanwhile, Martha quietly mopped the floor. As she moved the mop back and forth, she watched Mr. Harrington's face. She saw the flicker of pain in his eyes as one doctor raised his voice near the bed. She noticed how his breathing became uneven when certain treatments were given. She thought of the healer from her village, a man with wrinkled hands who always said, "Look with your heart, not just your eyes. The body tells its story if you listen carefully." She realized the doctors, for all their learning, were not truly listening to Mr. Harrington. They were only listening to their machines and numbers. That evening, when the family was gathered in the waiting room, Martha quietly tidied the space. She overheard Claire speaking to her brother. "They don't know what's wrong," she said, her voice breaking. "They're trying everything, but he's getting worse. I don't know how much longer he can fight like this." Her brother shook his head in frustration. "What's the point of bringing in the best doctors if none of them can do anything?" His words cut through the silence. Even the sister, who usually stayed calm, wiped tears from her eyes. Martha felt her chest tighten. She wanted to say something, but fear held her back. She was a housekeeper, not a doctor. What if they laughed at her? What if they thought she was disrespectful? But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something important. The following morning, Mr. Harrington's condition worsened. His skin grew paler, his breathing shallower. The doctors huddled around, whispering urgently. They increased the oxygen, adjusted the machines, and ordered more tests. The family was told to prepare for the worst. Claire broke down in tears, holding her father's hand tightly, refusing to let go. The room was filled with despair, and even the most confident doctors looked defeated. In the middle of this storm, Martha continued her work. She replaced the flowers by the window with fresh ones, arranged the magazines neatly on the table, and smoothed out the bed sheets. As she leaned over to adjust the blanket, she noticed something again, the same faint sign she had seen before, the same detail that reminded her of that village sickness. Her hands froze for a moment. The realization grew stronger in her mind. It wasn't just a coincidence. She was almost certain now. Her heart pounded as she looked around the room. The doctors were too busy arguing to notice her. The family was too caught up in their grief. Martha stood quietly, torn between her fear and her conscience. If she spoke and was wrong, she would be embarrassed forever. But if she stayed silent and was right, Mr. Harrington might not survive. That night, as the room finally grew quiet and the doctors left, Martha lingered a little longer than usual. She sat on the edge of her cart, staring at the billionaire who had always treated her kindly in his mansion. She remembered the times he greeted her politely, asking about her family, unlike many others who ignored her. He had given her steady work and respect when others looked down on her. The thought of losing him filled her with sadness. As she cleaned the bedside table one last time, she whispered softly to herself, "What if I'm the only one who sees this?" Her words faded into the quiet hum of the machines. She walked out of the room with her heart heavy, knowing that soon she would have to make a choice whether to remain silent or to risk everything and speak the truth she believed she had seen. Night fell heavy over the hospital, and the billionaire's room was quieter than usual. The machines still beeped softly, nurses walked in and out, but there was a strange tension in the air. Everyone could feel it. Mr. Harrington's body was weaker than ever, and the doctors had warned the family that the night might be critical. Claire sat by her father's side, holding his hand firmly, whispering prayers. She had barely eaten in days. His son walked back and forth in the hallway, stopping every few minutes to press his face into his hands. Their aunt sat in silence, clutching a small cross in her palm, her lips moving with whispered words of faith. Around midnight, an alarm suddenly went off. The heart monitor beeped frantically, and the oxygen machine gave a warning signal. Nurses rushed inside, calling for the doctors. Within minutes, all 20 of them were in the room, pulling at wires, checking the monitors, and shouting orders. "Increase the oxygen," one yelled. "Prepare the injection," another said. Their voices overlapped in confusion. Everyone was frantic. The family stood in shock, their hearts sinking as they watched the team of specialists scramble. Mr. Harrington's body shook slightly, and then went still. His breathing grew uneven, short, and shallow. His chest rose and fell in quick gasps, his eyes half open as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Panic filled the room. The billionaire who once stood tall in boardrooms now looked fragile as a leaf about to fall. Martha had stayed behind that night, finishing her cleaning slowly. She usually left earlier, but something had pulled her to linger. When the alarms rang, she froze in the hallway, watching through the half-open door as the scene unfolded. Doctors surrounded the bed, arguing louder than ever. Machines flashed numbers, but no one seemed to agree on what was happening. Her heart pounded as she watched. She didn't understand the medical terms they were throwing around, but she could see the signs. She saw the way his fingers twitched weakly, the way his eyes rolled back, the strange stiffness in his body, and above all, that faint odor in the air again. She had smelled it before, years ago, when she was a child in her village. An old neighbor had been sick with something unusual, and everyone thought he would die. The doctors from the city didn't know what to do, but a village healer had recognized the signs. Martha had never forgotten it. The memory now felt as clear as yesterday. She pressed her hand to her chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. Everything about Mr. Harrington's condition reminded her of that sickness. And the strange part was that the treatment back then had been surprisingly simple, nothing like the complicated procedures the doctors were attempting here. But what could she do? She was just a housekeeper. She could mop floors and polish glass, but how could she open her mouth in a room full of brilliant doctors? They wouldn't listen. They might laugh. They might even get angry and throw her out. Her mind raced as she stood frozen at the door. She wanted to turn away, but her heart refused. As the chaos inside grew louder, she saw Claire crying desperately, holding her father's hand, begging him to stay. Martha felt her throat tighten. She thought of all the times Mr. Harrington had spoken kindly to her in the mansion. Unlike many rich people, he had never treated her like she was invisible. He asked about her children, he greeted her politely, and once, when she was sick, he even told her to take the week off with pay. That small act of kindness had meant the world to her. Her eyes welled with tears. Could she really stand by and watch him slip away when she felt she knew something no one else did? Her instincts screamed louder than her fear. One of the doctors shouted, "He's not responding. We need to prepare for transport to Switzerland right away. It's his only chance." Another disagreed, "No, he won't survive the flight. We must stabilize him here first." The arguments grew heated, the voices sharp. In the middle of this, Martha noticed the tiny detail that no one else seemed to see, the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint discoloration near his lips, the way his pulse flickered oddly on the monitor. She remembered those exact signs from the sick man in her village. The healer had said, "The sickness is not where everyone is looking. The body is telling a different story." Her decision formed in her mind. She could no longer stay quiet. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The doctors hardly noticed her at first. She walked slowly, her voice small but steady. "Please," she whispered, "I think I know what's wrong." The room fell into a strange pause. A few doctors turned their heads, frowning. One of them said sharply, "We're in the middle of a crisis. Please step out." Martha's heart raced, but she stood her ground. She looked straight at Claire, whose tear-streaked face lifted toward her. "Miss Claire," Martha said, her voice full of urgency, "I've seen this before. It's not what they think. It's something else. Please, you must listen." Claire blinked in surprise. She had known Martha for years, trusted her as someone loyal and honest. In this moment of desperation, she saw something in Martha's eyes she couldn't ignore: an intensity, a certainty. "What do you mean?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. The doctors groaned, shaking their heads. "This is nonsense," one muttered. "She's not a doctor." Another said firmly, "We can't waste time listening to untrained staff." But Claire held up her hand to silence them. She turned to Martha. "Tell me," she whispered, "what do you see?" Martha swallowed hard. She explained what she had noticed: the strange smell, the twitch in his fingers, the stiffness in his body. She spoke about the man from her village, how he had shown the same signs, and how the healer had recognized it as a rare condition. Her words were simple, not scientific, but filled with sincerity. For a moment, silence filled the room. Some doctors shook their heads, but others frowned thoughtfully. One finally said, "It's unlikely. But not impossible. We haven't tested for that." Another added reluctantly, "She may have a point. The symptoms do line up." Claire turned to the doctors, her eyes fierce. "Then test him," she demanded. "Right now." The doctors hesitated, pride battling with reason. But the billionaire's condition was critical, and they had nothing left to lose. Finally, one doctor ordered the test. The team moved quickly, preparing the equipment. Martha stood quietly in the corner, her hands clasped tightly, praying she hadn't made a mistake. Minutes felt like hours. The family held their breath as the results came in. The lead doctor looked at the screen, his eyes widening. He checked again, disbelief washing over his face. Slowly, he turned to the others. "She's right," he said, his voice heavy with shock. "We completely missed it." "That's exactly what it is." Gasps filled the room. Claire turned to Martha, her eyes wide with relief and gratitude. The doctors, humbled, began discussing treatment immediately. For the first time in weeks, there was a clear direction. A rare condition, overlooked by 20 brilliant minds, had been spotted by the quiet housekeeper. Martha's heart pounded. She had spoken, and she had been right. As the doctors rushed to begin treatment, Claire squeezed her hand tightly and whispered, "You may have just saved my father's life." Martha stood silently, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had done what she thought impossible, spoken up in a room where no one believed she had a voice. And now, everything was about to change. The hospital room had never been so quiet. For weeks, the air had been heavy with endless debates, doctors speaking in circles, and machines beeping in the background. But now, after Martha spoke and the results confirmed what she said, silence swept through the room. The doctors stood around, some with disbelief on their faces, others with shame. They had overlooked something so important, something so small but so obvious once Martha had pointed it out. Claire could hardly believe it herself. She had listened to the 20 doctors argue day after day, and now the housekeeper who had quietly dusted corners and changed flowers was the one who saw what they had missed. She held Martha's hand firmly, not caring what anyone thought. In her eyes, Martha wasn't just a housekeeper anymore. She was the only person who had noticed what mattered most. The lead doctor finally cleared his throat. "We need to begin treatment immediately," he said, his voice lower than usual. He gave quick instructions to the nurses, who rushed to prepare the medicine. It wasn't an experimental drug, nor was it anything complicated. It was simple, almost embarrassingly simple, compared to all the advanced machines and foreign treatments they had been discussing. The cure had been right there all along, but no one had seen it. Martha stood quietly in the corner, her hands clasped together. She did not feel proud. She only felt relief that Mr. Harrington might finally have a chance to live. She remembered how helpless Claire had looked only hours ago, crying by her father's side. Now there was hope, a fragile hope but brighter than anything they had seen in weeks. The treatment began that very night. The doctors monitored closely, writing notes, adjusting doses, and checking his vital signs every few minutes. The family didn't leave his side. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, holding his hand. His son stood silently at the window, staring out into the city lights, deep in thought. Their aunt prayed quietly, her lips moving faster now, as though thanking the heavens for the sudden change. The hours passed slowly, but by morning, something incredible happened. Mr. Harrington opened his eyes. Not just for a moment, not in a weak flicker, but fully. He blinked at the light coming through the window and squeezed Claire's hand faintly. Claire gasped in joy. "Daddy," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. His lips curved into the smallest smile, but it was more than enough to fill the room with hope. The doctors looked at each other in awe. "It's working," one murmured. Another nodded, unable to hide his surprise. For the first time, their patient's numbers improved. His breathing was steadier, his color returned, and the weak trembling in his body began to ease. Martha watched from a quiet corner, her heart swelling with gratitude. She whispered a prayer under her breath, thanking God for guiding her eyes when no one else had noticed. She did not step forward or ask for credit. She only wanted him to live. By the second day, the improvement was even clearer. Mr. Harrington could speak in faint whispers, asking for water and looking around the room with more awareness. Claire never left his side, feeding him small sips and telling him gently how much better he looked. His son, though still reserved, softened and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. The aunt's prayers turned into songs of thanks. The doctors, humbled but determined, followed the new treatment plan carefully. They spoke less, argued less, and listened more. For once, their voices carried not pride but caution and respect. They knew they had been saved from disaster by a woman they had ignored. Some of them looked at Martha differently now, nodding politely when she entered, no longer brushing her aside. One evening, Claire approached Martha in the hallway. "You saved him," she said softly. Her eyes were shining with tears. "If you hadn't spoken, we might have lost him." Martha shook her head humbly. "I only shared what I remembered, Miss Claire. I am not a doctor. I just saw what others didn't." Claire took her hands. "That is what makes it even more special. 20 doctors couldn't see it, but you did. You gave me back my father." Her voice broke, and she hugged Martha tightly. Martha, surprised, stood still for a moment before returning the embrace with warmth. Inside the room, Mr. Harrington grew stronger with each passing day. His voice, though soft, carried more strength now. He asked to see reports about his companies, showing the same sharpness that had once built his empire. His family smiled at the old spark returning to his eyes. Nurses whispered in the hallways about the miracle happening in room 7. Even hospital staff who had never met him before spoke about how rare it was for a man on the edge of death to recover so quickly. The doctors, still professional, began to admit the truth in private conversations. "We were blinded by our own knowledge," one confessed. "Sometimes the answer is simple, but we look too deep." Another added, that Housekeeper may not have medical training, but she saved us all from a failure we would never have forgiven ourselves for. Word spread quietly, though the family kept details private. They did not want the world to know too much until Mr. Harrington was fully recovered. But inside that hospital, everyone knew the truth: the billionaire had been saved because a housekeeper noticed what no one else had. One night, when most of the staff had left and the family rested in the lounge, Mr. Harrington asked to speak with Martha. She entered the room nervously, unsure what to expect. He looked at her with weak but grateful eyes. "Martha," he said slowly, his voice still soft but steady, "they tell me you saved my life. She shook her head quickly. No, sir. I only said what I saw. The doctors. He raised a hand, stopping her gently. Don't be modest. I have built companies, I have signed deals worth billions, but all of that would mean nothing if you hadn't spoken when you did. You gave me more than life, you gave me another chance. Tears filled Martha's eyes. She bowed her head, too emotional to speak. He smiled faintly. People often think wisdom comes only with degrees and titles. But wisdom is also in the eyes that observe, in the heart that cares. You had both. And for that, I will always be grateful. The next morning, he insisted on telling his family what he felt. We owe Martha everything, he said firmly. She is no ordinary housekeeper. She is family to us now. Claire and her brother nodded, both already convinced of the same. Martha returned to her daily routine, still cleaning, still quiet, but now with a respect that surrounded her wherever she went. Nurses greeted her warmly, doctors acknowledged her with gratitude, and the family treated her with deeper kindness. She had not only saved a man's life, she had reminded everyone in that hospital of a simple truth that sometimes answers come from the most unexpected places. The sun was brighter through the hospital windows now. What had once been a room full of despair was now filled with quiet hope. Mr. Harrington sat up against his pillows, still weak but much stronger than before. His face had regained some color, and his eyes were alert, watching everyone with the sharpness that once made him a powerful leader in the business world. His family stayed close, never leaving him for more than a few minutes. The doctors checked his progress carefully, adjusting his treatment, but even they could not hide the relief that things were finally turning around. Everywhere in the hospital, people spoke of the miracle. Nurses whispered about how 20 doctors had struggled, but a quiet housekeeper had noticed what no one else did. Staff from other wings of the hospital found reasons to pass by the room, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had cheated death and the woman who had made it possible. Martha, however, continued her work quietly, almost shy of the attention. She cleaned the room as always, making sure everything was neat, speaking only when spoken to. She did not want praise, she only wanted Mr. Harrington to get better. One morning, as the doctors finished their rounds, Mr. Harrington asked everyone to leave except for his daughter, his son, and Martha. When the room was quiet, he looked at Martha with eyes full of gratitude. You may not understand what you have done for me, he said softly, his voice steady but emotional. When everyone else saw numbers, machines, and complicated problems, you saw me. You saw the truth no one else could. I will never forget that. Martha lowered her eyes humbly. I only spoke up because I cared, sir. Anyone would have done the same. His son shook his head. No, he said firmly. Most people would have stayed silent. You had the courage to speak when no one believed you had a voice. That courage saved our father. Claire reached for Martha's hand and squeezed it gently. You are family to us now. We won't ever treat you as just a housekeeper again. Tears filled Martha's eyes. She had worked for the Harrington family for many years, but in that moment, she felt truly seen for the first time. As days turned into weeks, Mr. Harrington grew stronger. He began walking slowly around the room with the help of a nurse, then later down the hospital hallway with his daughter beside him. Each small step felt like a victory. His voice grew stronger too, and soon he was making phone calls to his company, giving instructions with the confidence of old. People outside the hospital were shocked to hear his voice again, many believing he would never recover. When he was finally discharged, the hospital staff lined the halls to see him leave. Some clapped quietly, others simply smiled, but everyone knew they were witnessing a rare story, one that would be remembered for years. As he was wheeled out, he held Martha's hand in front of everyone. This woman saved my life, he said clearly. Never forget that. The words spread quickly. Newspapers picked up the story, though the family kept Martha's identity private at first to protect her from too much attention. Business magazines wrote about the billionaire's near-death experience, calling it a reminder that even the greatest wealth cannot guarantee health. But inside the Harrington family, the lesson was deeper. They had learned to value every voice, even the quietest ones, because sometimes wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. Back at the mansion, life slowly returned to normal. The halls that once felt heavy with worry now echoed with laughter again. Mr. Harrington often sat by the window in the evenings, looking out at the gardens. Martha would walk by, carrying fresh flowers or adjusting the curtains, and he would always greet her warmly. "How are you today, Martha?" he would ask, as if she were the guest of honor in his home. One evening, he gathered his family and Martha in the grand living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and the glow lit up the faces around him. He spoke slowly, his voice filled with emotion. "I have lived many years, built many companies, and earned more money than I ever imagined. But none of it would mean anything if not for this woman here. She reminded me that life is not only about wealth and power. It is about kindness, courage, and seeing what others miss." Claire smiled through her tears. His son nodded firmly. Even their aunt, who rarely spoke, added softly, "She was God's answer to our prayers." Martha, overwhelmed, tried to protest. "Please, sir, I don't deserve all this." But Mr. Harrington looked at her with gentle eyes. "You deserve more than you think. You saved me, Martha. And from now on, you will never have to worry about anything again. You will always have a place in this home, not as a worker, but as someone we honor." From that day forward, Martha's life changed. She continued to work, but her role was different. She was respected not just as staff but as someone the family trusted deeply. When guests came to the mansion, she was introduced proudly, and the story was told of how she had seen what 20 doctors missed. People looked at her with admiration, realizing that greatness does not always wear a title or a white coat. Sometimes, it comes quietly, dressed in humility. Months later, Mr. Harrington fully returned to his companies. The world welcomed him back with surprise and celebration. In his speeches, he often spoke of his recovery, but he always included the same line: "Never underestimate the wisdom of those around you, no matter who they are. The answer to your biggest problems might come from the person you least expect." Business leaders listened, but they also wondered about the mysterious woman he often mentioned with so much respect. In the mansion, Martha carried on her duties with the same care she always had, but now she walked with her head held higher. She knew she had made a difference that would never be forgotten. She had saved a man, restored a family, and reminded everyone that sometimes the quietest voices carry the greatest truths. And so, the story of the billionaire who could not be saved by 20 doctors but was rescued by his housekeeper lived on not as a tale of wealth or power, but as a story of courage, compassion, and the value of paying attention to the smallest details. It was told again and again, in hushed tones in hospital halls, in living rooms, and in offices, as a reminder that life is full of surprises and that heroes are not always the ones we expect. For Martha, it was never about glory. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. And for Mr. Harrington, it was about learning that the greatest gift he could ever receive was not his fortune, not his empire, but the second chance at life given to him by someone he once thought of as just a housekeeper, someone who turned out to be much more.